Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. It's widely agreed that consumer spending is falling due to depleting household savings that were accrued during the pandemic. Monash University's economics professor, Robert Brooks, says more cautious consumer spending is one of the biggest developing features of 2024. But he says inflation should be contained this year, so long as there are no more unexpected shocks. Professor Brooks is talking to Jeff Waters about what the household savings and spending landscape looks like in 2024.
2023 has turned out to be quite interesting. I think that the economic growth outlook globally and for Australia, people expected some reduction in growth. The question was, could you have monetary policy conducted in such a way that you had a series of interest rate changes that didn't land the economy into a recession? And it's turned out that while the interest rate changes have had a significant impact, parts of the economic outlook have still stayed a lot better than people would have thought with such a series of interest rate changes.
In retrospect, do we have a reason for that?
So I think the couple of things that have probably happened is parts of the global growth have stayed better than expected. The inflation impacts and its recovery has clearly varied across different countries significantly. Australia's been in the fortunate situation that demand for Australian commodities has still held up pretty well, which has put money into the economic system. And while the growth rate has clearly moderated and come down from where it was, and Australia was seen as very lucky from having recovered from the pandemic period quicker than a number of countries, we have been able to get to that path where we've been able to maintain some growth, which I think was the hope of both the government and the Reserve Bank when they started down that policy track.
So we're just speaking there about monetary policy versus global influences. Let's just start on the global influences, if I may. You mentioned commodity prices remained high, which is terrific, as you say, for Australia. But what else about the global economy was such that it didn't plummet itself into a global recession?
So a lot of the supply chain issues that had been a major problem had probably come to relief perhaps quicker than expected. I think there was also a question, particularly around the US and Europe, as to how much they were going to need to raise interest rates in each of those settings to be able to get inflation to turn back down towards more reasonable levels. And I think some of the expectations perhaps of how high the US and the UK and Europe were going to have to go with interest rates have not ended up materialising, and they've been able to bring about an inflation reduction without such a high movement in interest rates. The fact that the tendency for interest rate increases has moderated in each of those countries has been good for their economies, but it's also been a better economic outlook in the Australian setting, because I think part of the concern was around if interest rates had to go a lot higher overseas, what were the exchange rate implications of that for Australia? To what extent would that have led to a significant depreciation of the Australian dollar and then added to inflationary pressure with imported input costs? I think probably that monetary policy setting has not been as significant an increase perhaps in some of those other countries. I think people thought that the economy might prove less resilient to those interest rate increases and that growth would drop by more. There was always some projection that, the economies might be able to land at, yes, they would have a reduction in growth, but it wouldn't be too much. I think it's largely panned out that way, that despite some challenges, particularly in China, internal to the economy around, property markets and around the extent of savings behaviour of Chinese households, that China demand has held up reasonably well. It's clear that the trade situation particularly between Australia and China, has been improved. There's been a move to normalise. And also some industries have done really well across that challenging trade period by being able to get a much more diverse set of markets in which they were in.
So you mentioned the word lucky quite a lot there. Luckily, they could still keep buying our commodities effectively.
Look, luck is you always want to hope that randomness works for you in a positive way and that you get draws from the right tail of the distribution and not from the left tail. But I think the demand conditions have held up perhaps better than people had expected. Now, part of that's always good management, but part of that's also elements of good luck. And the challenge is always disentangling, what's good management and what's good luck. And you always need more data to be able to do that. But it's true that, growth is now lower than it was. That certainly is the case. But there was probably no scenario where the growth rate wasn't going to come off across the world.
There's always a next step for your business. There's always help at every stage. As you grow your business, we're here to support you every step of the way. Move forward with Mazars. Visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.
You also mentioned monetary policy a while back there. Can I ask, how much influence can the Reserve Bank and the federal government have over this situation, particularly since so much of it was global? They've raised interest rates and it appears to have worked, but is that also just luck?
No, I don't think it's purely luck. I think there's an element of really good policy settings there as well, Jeff. So part of it has been, it's one of the things that the Reserve Bank sort of spent the year trying to work out is, where do you think the causes of inflation are? How much of it have been global factors about supply chains and oil prices? How much of it have been a concern that the inflation environment might have started a demand for higher wage increases that might then have fed into further inflation? And how much of it has been around the discretionary components of people's spending and what would happen to demand there? Now, global conditions have certainly improved, and they've improved for a range of reasons outside of the policy settings in Australia. We haven't really seen any significant wage breakout, which was a concern that the Reserve Bank had at various times. Would the higher inflation translate into higher wage demands? That, by and large, has not happened in any significant way. People's wage increase has been relatively moderate. There's some sectors where it's clearly been higher, but overall it's still been fairly moderate. And the other issue, which I think the Commonwealth sort of grappled with, is having ended up with a much larger than anticipated budget surplus, in part because of greater revenue issues, in part due to commodity prices, but also in part to employment staying at high levels. How much of that surplus potentially was going to be spent on things that might be inflationary versus how much of it would be saved. And the government's it's had a very strong restraint narrative to what it can reasonably do without adding inflationary pressure. The challenge for the Reserve Bank's always been this dilemma of how many interest rate increases do you need and, when do you stop them and that you might have tipped it too far. And I think they've become more, trying to read Reserve Bank outlooks is always a really interesting exercise. But I think it's clear that they've seen elements of their policy setting that have moved to take that discretionary demand out of the system. All the available evidence suggests that a lot of households have run down the savings that they built up and that the savings rate has dropped away. And part of maintaining people's consumption activities was running down that savings. Well, that savings buffer for a lot of households has now, significantly dissipated. So I think the demand conditions have ended up looking to be really positive outlook. And I think they'll have a look over the summer and see what additional shocks might come into the system. But even the early analysis around, the sort of Black Friday type sales was even that hadn't produced a significant surge in consumer demand compared to what it might have done in the past.
Which is a lovely segue to 2024 and what we can expect of this year that is upon us. How do you see the economy playing out, bearing in mind that there's a lot of small business people listening who would be drastically affected by a decrease in consumption?
So the growth rate outlook is clearly lower than it was. So I don't think there's a significant expectation of growth getting back to higher levels till at least 2025. So there has been a tapering of that growth in the system. And, the growth forecasts are starting with a 1 in front of them and not with a 2. And no one seems to be projecting getting back to that significant growth until 2025. The question is, I think in an outlook sense around, can there be a reasonable degree of confidence that inflation is moving back to what the Reserve Bank would see as an acceptable target band quickly enough? And to the extent that that remains the case, that reduces the need for further official interest rate increases and flow through. So I think the outlook on that has become more positive. I think the Reserve Bank will clearly watch what happens with inflation, and they will be trying to unpack, what are the sources of inflationary pressure in the system. But I think at the moment, the view would be that they've done a lot of that heavy lifting piece already. It, I think, does mean demand, remains flat, and the government's got some difficult policy choices ahead as, it thinks about how the budget looks and the macroeconomic settings. But it would appear, at least on the data so far, that we've got to a reasonable outlook for 2024. Are we going to be back into a booming higher growth outlook in 2024? That would seem to be extremely unlikely. That looks like a 2025 at best scenario.
That's Monash University's Economics and Business Statistics Professor, Robert Brooks. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.